Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Entry Level Left podcast, your starting point for leftist political literacy. Our goal is to educate others about contemporary issues and events through a leftist, Marxist, and socialist lens. We're glad to have you join us for our first episode, which is an introduction to socialism. As many of you may be aware, political opponents often try to misrepresent their opposition or even blatantly lie about their motives, origins, or virtues. The burden of investigation into these matters often falls most heavily on those who are least equipped to navigate these challenges. In our modern, hyperpolarized climate of American politics, where truth is becoming more and more obscured by moneyed interests and the resulting bias, we find it necessary to define what constitutes a left-wing approach to politics in order to establish a reliable point of reference for critique. In October of 2018, the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors, or the CEA, published a report about the opportunity cost of socialism in response to a growing popular sentiment for socialism in the public discourse. The definition of socialism suggested in this government report misrepresents the focus of socialism as purely state control of income or wealth distribution, with little regard to democratic worker ownership of the means of production. The report further details that under socialism, goods and services would be handed out free of charge, which in turn the report says would offer little material incentive for production and innovation, and prevent price signals from revealing economically important information about costs and consumer needs or wants. Not only is this a misrepresentation of socialism as a political economic system, but it's also not completely accurate to say that a heightened quality of life for individuals in society under socialism would necessarily decrease productive or innovative tendencies in an economy. It's also not entirely true that information about consumer needs or wants are only revealed through price signals available under free market capitalism. The report goes on to call many so-called socialist states undemocratic and characterize a faulty view of the failures of these so-called socialist states by their inability to produce enough food to combat starvation. Not only are these cherry-picked examples implicitly biased against so-called socialist states, they don't detail the nuance of the situations or any external influence and economic sanctions imposed by the U.S., which may have directly impacted the viability of these nations on the world stage in the first place. To cast further suspicion on this CEA report, it explains that democratic socialists differ from other socialist contemporaries in that they disagree with state brutality and would allow individuals to privately own the means of production in many industries, which is not characteristic of socialism, but rather welfare state capitalism. The report continues along this line of misrepresentation by stating that the experiences of those under the Nordic economic model in Europe represent a failure of socialism to improve living standards in comparison to free market capitalism. However, the Nordic countries like Norway or Sweden have never operated under a socialist political economic system. Contrarily, the Nordic model is a representation of welfare state capitalist economy with privatized industry. In many respects, there have been studies that show increased satisfaction and quality of life under the Nordic model when compared to nations like the US. The CEA report bases a full analysis of living standards solely on a rigid conception of GDP, without consideration to the impact that free schooling or government-subsidized healthcare and childcare or many other things might have on the well-being of society. From this report, we can only deduce that our government in the U.S. at best doesn't understand the political economic system of socialism, or at worst, is dedicated to its misrepresentation in the political arena. To clearly define socialism, we need to understand the modern root of the political economic philosophy, which was developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The first formal articulation of this political platform, which was titled The Principles of Communism, was first drafted by Friedrich Engels in 1847. This draft would serve as the predecessor of the Communist Manifesto, published in late February of 1848. Communism is the philosophical, social, political, economic ideology and associated movement whose goal is to install a new socio-economic order in which there is common public ownership over the means of production, abolition of social classes, money, and the state. Socialism, however, is merely the political economic system in which the workers own and democratically self-manage the means of their own production. The historical and ongoing conflict between social classes, the working class or proletariat, and the owning class or ruling class, the bourgeoisie, is theoretically understood to be the root cause of all material struggles in society through the Marxist analysis of historical materialism. Tonight we will discuss socialism, capitalism, and communism to further distinguish their concepts, origins, and implications. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. I've got with me here
Jared,
Nathan,
and myself, Matt. In everyday speech, our interactions online, and in non-academic circles, there can be quite a bit of linguistic confusion in separating the concepts that distinguish capitalism from socialism, as well as socialism as a mode of economic production from the political economic theory of communism. The modern distinctions have a long legacy, but these distinctions were principally outlined by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 19th century, with both the Principles of Communism and then subsequently the Communist Manifesto, where a political platform for this economic and political revolution from capitalism to socialism was formed. So the first question I want to pose to the group is, when we think of capitalism and we think of socialism and we look at Marx's works as, some would say, principally a critique of capitalism, what do we notice are the basic distinctions of capitalism and its mode of production?
So I actually want to kind of take a stab at this one, specifically in relation to modes of production, because I don't know that that's always commonly or easily understood when we talk about Marxism, communism, and socialism. So essentially in capitalism, the modes of production are first the productive forces, which includes human labor that is hired to work, etc., in conjunction with the means of production, which includes the materials, the infrastructure, and so on that are owned specifically by the capitalist to manufacture and distribute a commodity. So now the second mode of production under capitalism would be the social and technical relations that are produced by this commodity manufacturing, selling, and so on in the quote-unquote free market. So this would include class relations between worker and CEO, power relations between the workers themselves, so worker v. manager, and the government and the social relations it produces in a capitalist society, and the reproduction of knowledge in society required to keep the economy going. So basically, to make that a little bit easier to digest, under capitalism, the mode of production is the capitalist class owns the infrastructure and capital required to mass produce and distribute a commodity on the market, whereas the workers are hired for a wage to manufacture and assist with the distribution of that commodity. And so this is a key point because the wage is paid from money that was already accounted for by the capitalist, whether through inherited wealth, a loan, it doesn't matter. Because of this, all the profits from the commodity on the market are owned and distributed by the capitalist. So from this, a variety of social relations develop, ranging from inequality and the social ills that produces to structural adjustments by the government that either favor or hinder the profits of the capitalist class. And if I can just riff on this a little bit more, I want to be as blunt and as basic as possible for socialism so that there's no confusion. The mode of production of socialism is essentially the workers make and manufacture the product, and therefore the wealth it produces is distributed and owned by the workers, not the capitalists, the workers. So the materials, infrastructure, and so on are commonly owned amongst them, the workers. The government's role is really just to facilitate and maintain common ownership of resources in society in a way that is highly democratic and accountable and ensures the general welfare of the many and not the few, period. So any abstraction or variation from that would be like a perversion, of that. Ultimately, it must mean the most economically democratic process in terms of how things are produced in society and the wealth that they generate.
You still have production in socialism, so it's not that one is producing any different. It's just the way that things are organized and the property relations that underpin those things. So those are some basic distinctions between them. But when we talk about mode of production, it's really essentially the gist of it is you have commodities, they're produced. Who owns the means of production? And who benefits from the profit of it?
Yeah, it's pretty much how is something produced, and then what are the various actors and processes involved in that production, whether it's the worker being hired by the capitalist to develop a particular product or their technological knowledge capital required to produce that product that the capitalist pays for via a wage, or the materials that are required to produce something that are owned by the capitalist himself.
Yeah, I think the central kind of litmus test to this whole thing is the difference between capitalism and socialism, as you said, has to be who owns the means of production. So even when you're looking at self-proclaimed socialists like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren types, they're not necessarily actual socialists by definition because they aren't advocating for a system, well, not openly advocating for a system where the workers control the means of production. Some liberals will say kind of the meme is the socialism is the roads and the police stations and the social security payments, but it's not. We live in a social democracy, so until there's a transfer of wealth from the ownership class to the working class, we can't call anything socialism.
Right.
So I just wanted to kind of double down on that point.
Yeah. Essentially,
it's going to hit.
Yeah, definitely. It's essentially like the sort of quote unquote socialism that's advocated by that group is a social democracy. Like it's very much the capitalist structure. It just implements like more state intervention to try and like push back on the most grotesque ills that free reign market capitalism produces. And there's still elements of that, obviously, today in American society. Like there's still carryover from the welfare state in the sense that like we have Social Security, we still have Medicaid, we have Medicare, but it's constantly under attack. What little like pebbles are there versus like a more stronger and robust social democracy, like in like Sweden and all that stuff. I mean, we'll get to that in later episodes, but even still just talking about that, even in those societies where they are more robust, like there's still all these contradictions and whatnot that are.
Yeah, there's still some sort of ownership class, even if the effects are kind of mitigated. Again, going back to this kind of one size fits all test: who owns the means of production? The other thing too that I thought was kind of interesting, and maybe we'll talk about this in later episodes, is that some people more on the further left will even take something like the USSR and debate whether or not it's true socialism because the means of production was never actually it might have been for debatably a short time, but eventually was not in the hands of the working class. That's something, of course, that you could never debate with probably a conservative. But further on the left, you will hear that kind of dialogue.
Yeah. It's definitely an ambiguous debate to have because then you get into, bureaucratic structures and like how much bureaucracy interferes with those type of democratic processes. But let's actually dig in a little bit further with the mode of production. Like, let's take an example. When we have a capitalist economy, basically it's characterized by wage labor in mass. So a lot of wage labor, and essentially that wage labor is used to produce goods, and that means of production that we were talking about is that startup capital. It's that ownership over a public resource, for example, could be like water resource or fuel resources, coal, gas, things like that. But some person, some private owner has claim to that resource. That's an example. There are many others, but they have this private access. They have this private property, which is often inherited and, sometimes not, but in most cases, most of the wealth is inherited. So I think almost like 60% of the wealth in the U.S. is inherited.
And to get more specific, it's also not just sometimes wealth. It's also kind of different forms of capital, like social capital, or even sometimes privilege from your social class,
standing
race,
in that society, right?
Sex, things like that.
Yeah.
So it's not even just sometimes the wealth. It might actually be other forms of capital as well that kind of give you an advantage over others.
Yeah. I think we will kind of touch on that later, but I think really like to sum it up, without getting too like meta into it, realistically, like in capitalist society, if you take your example of like some guy owns a plot of land, more than likely inherited, that says like it's got a bunch of coal in it or a bunch of oil or something, and he has all this wealth, and access to it, he can then hire workers who can extract it, and then he can sell it on the market, and he just pays them their wage out of, essentially capital that already existed, and all new capital generated goes to him and his family, and or maybe like lightly to like the managerial classes or something. But versus a socialist society in which the wealth generated in some sort of industry or anywhere, it might, that's kind of old school. Like even if you use Amazon as an example, it'd be like the Amazon workers owning the resources or owning the wealth that they generate. And now to some people that takes more of like a co-op aspect. Well, they generate all these billions of dollars and then they just like split it amongst themselves. But I think, at least in my interpretation, anyone could disagree. I don't want to get too into it. Just in my interpretation of like a more socialistic approach is, when we say the wealth that it generates, it means more like they have democratic control over their workspace and their work life. So the more that they generate, maybe the more time they can take off, the more access to social capital they have, versus like just strictly like a monetized value. I mean, these are all questions that like we don't necessarily have answers to, because we haven't actually established any form or attempt at like a real socialist future. But like, these are things that can be understood, or we can begin to think about when we talk about like, what would a socialist society or socialist means of production truly look like and manifest as materially.
When we think about it, though, we have to really be deliberate when we characterize the mode of production under capitalism, because essentially, like we just talked about, if someone owns a resource and they're paying workers to harvest the resource or produce the resource, manufacture, refine the resource in some cases, they're never paying exactly that price. What they get for that resource in the market is never congruent or relative to what they're paying the employee. What they're paying the employee is always decided on a wage basis. So they're not necessarily having democratic access to that distribution. To give a concrete example, they may sell like a ton of, it could be anything like push pins or something like that, right? So they sell a ton of push pins and they make $120 off that ton of push pins. Maybe it costs, let's say, $15 to produce that with, machines and electricity and things like that. And so most of that is going to most of that is a profit margin. And, ideally under capitalism, where you're trying to consolidate everything and make things the most efficient way possible. So most of that is profit in a lot of cases. Of course, it's different per product, per commodity. But if most of that is profit, most of that, again, is not being seen in any way, shape, or form by the worker themselves.
To just like refine that even too a little bit more, is it's almost like if you have a guy who owns a sweatshop that makes Nikes, right? And it costs $2 worth of supplies to make the Nike. Well, it costs him another $2 to pay the guy, the person, the male, female, whatever, that made the Nike. But then what does he ultimately sell the Nike for, right? He sells it for like $100. So everything beyond that $4 goes to the capitalist, right? So the $2 for the shoe already reproduced itself. The next $2 is to pay the wage of the employee, and then anything after that is siphoned off the top. That's not an exact measurement. That's not the scale. That's the general theory or premise of it.
Jared works at Nike.
Yeah.
So essentially the Marxist take on it is the surplus value is essentially being extracted. So you see that, especially, we'll get into it in later episodes, but you see that especially in labor markets that are foreign and where the cost of living is different. And so they, like, a capitalist may not necessarily have to pay the same wage that they'd pay a first world employee for that same type of work. So we'll get into that more when we go into like globalized markets in the next couple of episodes. We do absolutely consider that there are, certain risk factors involved that money may go to. It's definitely not all just simplified, $4 is going to the worker and the supplies, and then the rest is going to the capitalist. It's of course not that
theoretical. Yeah.
I mean, we know that it's not that simple. So, when we talk about these type of things, we're never trying to make like a snap knee-jerk reaction to a situation. We understand that there are other costs in there, and it's not just that simplified. But in a large scale, it's essentially employers that mass manufacture products. They're essentially paying a wage, and that wage in a lot of cases is only what is required for that worker to essentially show up the next day. Make sure that they have the bare minimum that it takes to pacify them and keep them showing up to work the next day. In most cases, especially, like low-skilled jobs. So that leads us to our next point of discussion. And this is something that I'm sure that we all have tons of experience with, both firsthand and through friends. But let's talk a little bit about this mode of production and the social effects of it. Like, what What type of social problems do you guys see arising from a system that is built on essentially exploiting or coercing people into working adjacent to, their productive value?
Yeah, so I think the biggest social problem that arises, quite frankly, is social and material inequality, under capitalism at least. So the hoarding of resources for the well-to-do obviously reproduces inequality that affects a person's ability to house and feed themselves adequately. And that type of inequality also charges like generational interest, meaning like if you're born poor, you will more than likely die poor. And I think the wage labor system itself generates a very toxic and individualistic series of social relations because a person's employment can in many cases be life or death for them, like if it's relying on healthcare or something. So it makes us very protective and competitive with one another over things we shouldn't have to be so competitive over. Like you should have access to a general standard of quality of living. So obviously this type of competition over resources and the ability for someone to reproduce their material existence, i.e. feed and house themselves, it's going to cause us to be more antagonistic towards one another, which leads us to all these like nonsensical ideas about human nature and all that bullshit about humans being biologically prone towards like inequality or whatever.
And to double down too, you mentioned generational interest. It's not just generational interest as well. If you look at, like, for example, all the crashes, the people who recover the fastest after a recession, which is very relevant to us,
right, of course,
happened in 2008, and it looks like it's going to happen again.
We're going into another one.
Every time these happen, you can essentially witness the wealth move upwards. So it's not even, it's smaller than generations at this point. There's like a cyclical interest, but not to hammer too much home on inequality. I think Jared covered that pretty well. A very traditional Marxian answer to this question is actually about alienation, which I know we're going to cover probably in depth later on. So after kind of the advent of specialized labor, people were turned into producers of individual parts, not necessarily entire products. Mm-hmm. So eventually the contributions of each laborer are so segmented, it's impossible to see what their contribution is at all. And that's not just the individual, but also the people who are consuming the products, which actually kind of forms the basis of all Marxist forms of alienation. Cue the existential dread. As an example, most furniture isn't built by a tradesman. It's built by an assortment of low-skill laborers who are not in control of the design or the use of the product, and especially the sale of the product. It'd be absurd to say that someone who spends their entire workday cutting and sanding the exact same shape of wood is some sort of high-skilled tradesman. So it becomes kind of even more absurd when laborers are placed in roles that have no direct contact with the products, like IT or HR or sales, for example. It becomes almost impossible to take kind of a step back and say, wow, that's a job well done, because you're never actually familiar with completing a product in its entirety. Capitalism sort of alienates the workers from one another as well, which is the detriment to our social lives. Workers compete not only for higher wages, but they also compete for things like promotions or just open available opportunities. So it becomes easy to imagine a person as their role and not necessarily the individual who they are contributing to a larger picture or to a product or some kind of good for society. Seeing someone who may succeed may signal kind of like a threat to your own social standing, raising kind of like a subconscious tension that becomes hard for workers to express. So these things are pretty minute. It's hard for me to say, well, I'm secretly jealous of so-and-so because they have a better job than me and I wish I could fulfill that role. There's only so many of these roles to go around. But at the same time, we can kind of imagine that they put some kind of tension in our life to get Freudian on us. And kind of last here too, in your question, you had mentioned how can socialism kind of combat that? And I think this is one of those areas where it becomes so abstract, it is a little bit hard to kind of really hammer home on how socialism would fix that. But that said, it's still like an identifiable problem within capitalism that we can assume socialism might have some kind of answer for. But workers' co-ops are kind of a way that people have used to discuss involving people more in the fruits of their production.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's like, I think what you just hit on, like all like fire points. I think one that was really good is like this notion of like the alienation from like even the other workers, because like I've even noticed in jobs I've worked at, people obviously are like doing work, like they're working an 8-hour day, they're doing, getting shit done. But like you'll hear like those workers who have like maybe been stagnant in the same position, haven't had a promotion or a raise in a while, and they'll be like, "Oh, what the fuck does so and so even do?" You know what I mean? Like it's never like, why the hell hasn't my boss given me a raise in like 6 years? It's what the fuck does so and so do? You know what I mean? Like as opposed to, and then on top of that too, like you were talking about, well, how might like socialism kind of combat these things where there's not this alienation? I think just one of the things, without getting too much into it, but just kind of going back to a further or a previous point was, it kind of addresses it. And if the workers own the means of production, if they own the wealth that they produce, then they're all cooperatively hands-on with one another. It's not like this guy right here dictates to everyone. And even if there is still that person that's put in that role, it's democratically elected. It's the management or the manager roles are like voted on or elected or chosen by the workers in a way where the workers still control all of the power. So they always are aware of what's going on. And I think it really negates and limits the sort of alienation, not only with, well, what the fuck does so-and-so do or whatever, but also like, so amongst the workers, but also with what it is they produce, how much they produce from it, and like what degree of wealth or social capital are they generating from that.
Ideally also, it'd be as democracy as direct as possible. So removing those bureaucratic barriers. So, as direct as possible, avoiding sort of like representative or like Republican structures like that. So we talked a lot about different conceptual effects or social problems that arise from capitalism. For example, initially we touched on exploitation. We talked a little bit about how that exploitation can certainly be coercive, considering other social circumstances, things like generational lottery. And then beyond that, we talked a little bit about alienation, or we talked a lot about alienation, but we hinted at atomization, which I think is very, very characteristic of capitalism in and of itself. But essentially, it makes us more individualized, I feel, than we are naturally made out to be, or naturally feel inclined to be. Because again, it introduces that sort of hierarchy where it's like you're worried about what that other person is doing, because fundamentally you don't have a democratic way to voice how you feel about these things. You have no direct control over your wealth generation. It starts to sap some creative ability from you because you realize that you don't have a direct connection to any type of value that you're producing. And we get a lot of people start to feel, negatively about this. You get depression, you get all types of other social problems that may not necessarily be completely linked to just one factor, but certainly these factors of this political economic system that we live under in the U.S. does play a role in it. So,
especially anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. Anxiety is a huge thing too. Anxiety, depression, suicide rates up the roof. Yeah, so it's all sort of relative there. But when we talk about these four big words, these things like exploitation, coercion, alienation, atomization, what about these things are characteristic to capitalism? Like, why are they specific to capitalism and inherent to capitalism and the way that it reproduces society?
So I don't know that I have an exact answer for that, because it's kind of like a lot, at least for me. But I know one thing.
Right. It's a tall order.
Well, one thing is like, I like that you mentioned this like atomization aspect, because in the traditional, which I feel like sometimes, I think it's the whole point we kind of did this podcast, right? Is like sometimes people get like so bogged down in like the traditional Marxian interpretations of everything. Like when they talk about like worker exploitation, it's always in the convention of like some like fucking dude in 1905, like working in a factory, you know what I mean? That just is non-fucking existent anymore. But this element of like atomization is really, really important. And actually there's a book. I mean, you don't have to like read it. You could just watch a fucking lecture on it. It's actually by David Graeber. I mean, he's an anarchist, and like people can whatever about that, but he actually brings up this notion of like what's called like bullshit jobs, which is like this increased in within the like managerial sector, because there's more of like a technocratic aspect of capitalism now, like more people getting degrees, like looking for like more of these like more technocratic kind of positions and stuff like that. There's sort of this atomization where like people are put into these little like cubicles or little boxes of a type of work for a company that is so it's a bullshit job. It's like you're managing the manager's managing of something, you know, or like
right.
you're the principal of marketing relations, but like all you do is update a Facebook page every couple hours or something, like, and there's already someone there who kind of does the same thing. Like it increases this like, it's like, I don't know if bureaucratic's the right word, but it like compartmentalizes and reproduces like exponentially this just like nonsensical roles for the sake of I don't even know how to like put it into words.
You have like a sort of a sense of like ennui about it. You're so enamored by the lack of stimulation because you have one specific role that you may not perform repeatedly. You may not necessarily feel like it really does anything. And I've certainly had, you know, positions and jobs where I felt that way, where it's like, not only am I not really directly in control or feeling creative in any way over what I'm doing, but I also recognize that like what I'm doing is not really important to the capitalist or my boss either.
Right. Well, I think it's just like they're making all these positions to do all these different things that are so like, they honestly are kind of a disservice to the worker, because it's like if you're a part of this technocratic class and let's say you got a degree in whatever and then you get hired to do this particular job and you only do this one thing, I mean, you have to pretty much be a really good bullshitter on your resume to make it seem like you've done all this amount of work when really you're doing something in an hour, or something that takes you an hour in an 8-hour day, and the rest of the time you're on Facebook or fucking whatever. But anyway.
Yeah, like a really concrete example. A few weekends ago, I took a tour of the Yingling factory.
Mm-hmm.
They said that there's 120 jobs on site, but only 10 of them actually interact with the product whatsoever. So the 110 of them are just things like you said, marketing, finance, HR. They're all administrative duties, which is insane when you think about it. There's the majority, the vast majority, like over 90% of the employees that are working there aren't actually affecting the product whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that's kind of like a...
No, but that's exactly it. It's like it's just my main point for the whole reason of bringing this up, and like I probably didn't even hit everything the way I wanted to, which is fine, but like I think the whole point in bringing it up is like this atomization exists still today, and it's not just atomizing, it's also alienating too, and it's in this newer form of production where like everything nowadays is more about technology and knowledge production. I mean, I put knowledge in quotes, but like technology or some kind of production that isn't related to an actual, I put the pieces of this Ford together. You know what I mean?
It's adjacent to technology and it's supportive. I remember we went out once recently and we were having like lunch or whatever it was. And we were talking about how marketing is kind of like the language of capitalism.
The philosophy, the psychology, I would say. It's the psychology of capitalism.
Right, and how you have all these like auxiliary positions that essentially support like e-commerce or something adjacent to the product that really has no direct creative control, or whether like sometimes, you know, of course this isn't like a catch-all, you know, sometimes people will do art or graphics for a product or things like that where they may have some type of residual effect on it, but they're not really directly interfacing with it. They're not really feeling any sort of like creative fulfillment from the actual product. There's very little, like, unless you're kind of like a psychopath, like what kind of person really gets like insane amounts of enjoyment for designing like a logo for like Amscot or something like that? Like that, you know, that's not a thing.
Not to get like super meta about it or whatever, but
that's your favorite phrase, not to get super meta.
I know. Well, I mean, because it's like you can, when any leftist discussion can go into like space aliens and whatever in a short amount of time. Like,
we're all Posadas.
We're all Posadas now. No,
I'm a dolphin.
But my main point is that like there's also it's almost like this why marketing is so big, and it's even and it's so prevalent in any company, regardless of whatever you do. Is it like it's almost more about reproducing, and why you see this compartmentalization, atomization. is it's almost in these companies nowadays, it's more about reproducing culture, like a quote unquote company culture, than it is about producing an actual product, because it's almost like why, when you think, like we were talking about this earlier, capitalism for the majority of us, because of the mass marketing campaigns, the views that we have about certain corporations based on the like company culture that they can reproduce via all these people, is capitalism has become a lot like consciousness. You know, like it's we cannot as human beings fathom the end of consciousness. So it's extremely difficult for us to similarly imagine the end of a system that we have only known this one type of thing, you know, this one type of system for so long. And every time you turn on, you know, your TV or you're walking wherever, it's literally subliminal at this point, where it's just a repetition of it going in, you know, you're into you and reproducing it, like I guess in a mental fashion or like through like some kind of like philosophical means, where it's just what you think, the way you think constantly, because it's always there, constantly reproducing itself.
Right.
And there's this extreme wealth of people in companies now, especially after the tech booms and all that, where their sole purpose, even if they only work for a fucking hour a day, like actually work for an hour a day, I don't care if they're on, you know, their campus or whatever for 8 hours, where they're just reproducing the company culture within the company itself so that the workers buy the bullshit, and also so that those on the outside buy the bullshit.
So to get back to how you asked how class hierarchy has been propagated by the advent of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that profit motive always has a downward force on wages, which kind of propagates this entire inequality that we're talking about. So part of it is because that high wages aren't actually economically competitive. So with all other kind of factors held constant, like the materials that you're using, etc. For example, if Nike, like Jared said earlier, pays a sweatshop kid 10 cents an hour to produce t-shirts, and some ethical greenwashed brand pays them 10 an hour, then the price of the product will ultimately reflect that, and the consumer will in most cases still go with Nike. There is times, of course, where they'll use the kind of ethical green consumption as a marketing tactic, but in most cases, people are going to go with whatever the cheaper option is for the same quality. So investors are savvy to this, and as concrete proof, you can watch stock prices. Whenever wages go up, whenever a company, like for example, a few months ago, Walmart announced that they were going to raise their wages, you can go that exact day and you'll see their stock prices crash, because they know, the investors, for example, know that a company that pays their employees more are less economically competitive than one that just pays it what it needs to.
Right. And all of the companies that are competing with each other, Walmart in a sense does have a monopoly, but they do have competitors still, you know, for certain products. So those individual competitors, as broad as that could be, are competing with Walmart. When we look at that downward effect on wages that you're talking about, we see that ripple throughout the whole system. So that's not an isolated phenomena. That happens and ripples throughout.
Getting back to the original question that you asked, and just maybe wrapping it up with that, it's like I want to touch on this class hierarchy thing too that you mentioned. You know, how has class hierarchy been propagated by, you know, the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, all that stuff? You know, in regards to the whole class hierarchy thing, I mean, in many ways, like it already existed and had already existed like prior to capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, and so on. Just in this regard, class hierarchy was largely based on like the wealth you own via the business you develop or your place in the factory, like under capitalism, I mean. So are you a worker, are you a manager or a manager's manager? And based on that, what piece of the pie are you taking home? Or it could be like the technical capital you control, so the schooling you could afford, or, you know, whatever, to become like a lawyer or a doctor, and how does that affect your class standing in broader society, and so on and so forth. I don't know if that makes sense or is necessarily correct, but to be honest, the emergence of class hierarchy really gets emphasized under capitalism, primarily by one's like role in the workplace, initially at least. So it could have been the factory way back when. It could be, you know, in the campus, quote unquote campus, as the tech elites love today. Like, are you a worker? Are you a tier 1 manager? Or are you a capitalist? That system is distinctly tied, I would argue, to the emergence of industrial capitalism. That element, that system of class hierarchy, worker, manager, manager's manager, or the capitalists themselves, that is a distinctly industrial revolution, emergent capitalism type thing.
To get started, and kind of tie it all back together, I know we talked a lot about the alienation, the atomization, the exploitation, coercion, and we sort of segued it into this class hierarchy that is endemic to capitalism. I want to read a quote from Friedrich Engels from the Principles of Communism, and it goes, "The slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian must sell himself daily and hourly. The individual slave, property of one master, is assured an existence, however miserable it may be, because of the master's interest. The individual proletarian, property as it were of the entire bourgeois class, which buys his labor only when someone has need of it, has no secure existence. This existence is assured only to the class as a whole." So when I read that, what that is essentially talking about is that endemic class hierarchy. So this class hierarchy is introduced after the revolution from feudalism to capitalism, when property rights become a larger aspect of liberalism and the development of modern society. So with that in mind, I know we talked a little bit about it, but why do you think that this class system accurately describes what comes with capitalism? Why isn't it something else? Why isn't it just, some people are harder workers, or why is it necessarily a class system?
Well, I think I want to address this, but I'm going to kind of hit that feudalism thing first, and maybe through attempting to answer this, I'll get to the other stuff. But, feudalism was very similar to capitalism in that it sort of had these special kind of like managerial classes, and then like the king and everyone was pretty much like at the bottom tilling the land and living off bread and ale or whatever. Not to mention the emergence of patriarchal, and in the US case, like white capitalism owes pretty much its emergence to previous like feudal / mercantilist economic structures in which land was tied to white males' last names, which was carried on generationally by other men, et cetera, et cetera. However, capitalism is different in that it adds like this liberal element, I suppose, and that anyone can be a capitalist, not just a king or fucking whatever, which big quotes around anyone can be a capitalist, right? But I think the big revolution aspect comes with mass industrialization, in which there really is no wealth or means of sustenance in the ownership of small plots of land, and capitalism pretty much like obliterates the ability to own one's own labor small scale and make a living, hence the mass migration to like urban industrial centers and the rise of wage labor, so on and so forth. So this then leads, I guess to an extent, like to the mass alienation of the workers at large, as well as their hyper individualization, since they can be hired and fired at any point without really any control over any of it, as opposed to like previous systems, or at least even like the diet systems that existed before the total revamp of industrial capitalism. But this system is like the capitalist system is the most revolutionary, and that it is revolutionarily amoral. And I want to hit on that like so much, because this system does not give a shit about your suffering or whether you have kids or not. It doesn't give a single solitary fuck. And that is something that people really don't ever grasp about capitalism. And it's so fundamental because it's how the system stays alive. It lives by the it's not personal, it's just business mentality.
Right. It's not immoral, it's just outside of morality.
It's amoral. And that, it's not personal, it's just business thing. Like, and that is, it's really fucking insane when you think about it.
But that's just the common logic of capitalism.
Right, exactly. But I'm not saying like there weren't similar structures under feudalism or whatever, but like capitalism, more so than any other system, takes any kind of morals and so on and removes them entirely out of the question.
Or commodifies them.
Right, or commodifies them so that it can grow and acquire wealth indefinitely forever by just fundamentally not giving a shit about anything but profit. And that right there is so crucial to understand, and it's dangerous that people don't grasp this, like, what I consider revolutionary element of capitalism from feudalism, because it's the reason you have people thinking they're going to like fix climate change by taking shorter showers, as opposed to like nationalizing the energy sector and transitioning to a green universal jobs program. It's the reason why people believe they can make moralistic appeals to corporations. It's the reason why liberals believe if we just had like more women and people of color as CEOs, then capitalism wouldn't be so shitty. But that's literally all bullshit, because whether or not a corporation is giving out rainbow flag coffee cups or destroying the Amazon, the point is that the only reason they're doing either is to make a profit.
So we were talking a little bit about things that have held over from feudalism, and it's super obvious answer, but I kind of want to kind of explore it a little bit. The most obvious answer is actually there's still a monarchy in England. Did you guys know that?
Fuck the Queen. They killed Diana. Conspiracy. Illuminati.
No, don't get InfoWars on me.
Right, we're fucked now. Well, in any case, we don't need to discuss the monarchy in depth. I think if you go on BreadTube, there's actually a few really good videos. Shout out to Sean. But that said, there was an English emperor of India up until the current queen's dad. So when we're talking about kind of like a history of colonialism, it's not very far removed from where we are right now. It extended very far into very liberal democracies. That didn't just disappear with feudalism. So the entire kind of the imperial conquest, it didn't just end because we entered into a more democratic system, when England entered into a more democratic system. We still look at the history of the world kind of in terms of great people. So despite democracy being a core principle of our society, we still put faces to historical epochs, whether it's like King George or George Washington or President George W. Bush. We kind of use these single person representatives to define moments in history, which I think is still kind of like a carryover from feudalism in a way, because at that point it was all mostly
like a social reproduction.
Right.
Most decisions were down to one person. I don't think we've ever gotten past to looking at that. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
It is, yeah.
So on the off chance there are any capitalists listening to this podcast, I just want to...
You're still here.
I just want to go back and sort of hit on this point to really affirm it, in case you're doubtful about any of this information. Essentially, in any scenario where you are producing a product to sell on the marketplace, the free market, in terms of free competition under capitalism, really, you have employees, they're helping produce the product, and you will gain more money in any case by driving their wages down. If you can get them to produce at the same quality, good enough for your market sale, and pay them less, you will absolutely do that. Now, I'm not talking about, a general like business owner that's ethical and, may try to pay their employees $15 an hour. We're talking about a systemic critique of capitalism and how it functions on a global scale. We're not talking about an individual business owner that, pays their employees famously well, in an isolated scenario. We're talking about real marketplace critique. It makes sense to drive down wages, as we were talking about before. It makes sense for capitalism to have a downward effect on wages. So with that mode of production in mind and all the social ills and accompanying characteristics of it, socialism really we see as something that is not only just like a moral imperative, but it's a way of reorganizing society in a way that is more just in its distribution. The main takeaway for socialism and its mode of production, what you want to understand is workers democratically manage and own the means of their production, and it's separate from capitalism because capitalism privileges private ownership, and of course, without wealth distribution, those things can be stacked against a lot of people. And this is all steeped in deep competition. Competition is at the core of all this. So you can imagine how that reinforces some of the less savory characteristics of people's personalities and so on. So let's tie it all back together. And in doing that, I want to read a quote from the Communist Manifesto. And Marx states that communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriations. When we read that quote, I want to ask a question to the group. Communism is considered a doctrine outlining the conditions of liberation for the proletariat or the working class. With regards to that, what is the distinction between communism and socialism? And how might socialism be considered a process towards communism's ultimate goals?
I just want to hit this point because it's so crucial, and it's also so overdone and gone into too much like meta detail and shit by, I think, the left as a whole. So basically, at least as I understand it, socialism is a long-term process basically in which politics, culture, wealth and society, democratic governance, so on, whatever, are pretty much gradually turned over to the majority, or not pretty much, they're turned over to the majority and away from the minority. It is like the socio-political structure that ensures total material and economic democracy for all, not just for some. And it's a long-term socio-political structure that will require constant participation and struggle in order to achieve it. If there was a revolution tomorrow, for instance, we would more than likely never actually in our lifetime see the full universal benefits of the socialist project. Coming to terms with that almost is pretty much what makes someone truly a revolutionary, right? Now, communism is the universal realization generally of the socialist project, meaning it is the end goal, the magnum opus of the socialist project, in which through, the mass participation of socialism, insurance of democracy and economic security, reproduction of new culture on education and society, the state as an institution that facilitates and ensures many of these societal guarantees laid out under socialism is pretty much abolished along with class society. Not pretty much, once again, is abolished along with class society.
Right, so no hierarchy, no state,
right,
no money.
And this is the point I want to emphasize. It's not done by any like utopian magic wand, but gradually through the platforms laid out under socialism. Communism, much like the end of consciousness, it's like almost impossible to imagine given our current society and material upbringing. However, struggling for its outcome is to believe that a better world is possible, even if we will never necessarily see it. So with that said, like we as communists and socialists, like we don't claim to be utopian. Like any society in existence, there will be conflict and so on, but in a way that someone's material existence and material reproduction is not inhibited upon by the state or a single entity or conglomerate. A communist society, realistically, it's never existed, and the failures of past projects like shouldn't inhibit the struggle for a new one. So for while the global socialist project may have failed once, the capitalist project is designed to perpetually reproduce its own failure to the benefit of the capitalist class always, until ultimately it leads us towards basically planetary collapse.
Right, when they crash the stock markets and then buy up all the stocks at a low price and reconsolidate their wealth year after
and
year.
then hire everyone back that they had previously for half of what their wage was.
Someone say 2020.
Right.
Exactly. So that's what I think Marx means. There's definitely a generational difference there, but what Marx means is essentially that. Communism deprives no person of the power to appropriate the products of society. It just deprives that person the ability to subjugate others in pursuit of those appropriations.
There's like this huge misconception, and I know I'm going to double down on exactly what Jared just said, but I think it's incredibly important. Marx did not lay down any sort of utopian plan for communism. It didn't happen. I mean, you can read through like all 3,000 pages of Das Kapital, and there's only very, very kind of like mixed messages on what communism would be. And the central thesis that most people would agree on is, like you guys said, a classless, stateless society where the worker controls the means of production.
Right. People could disagree on that, though, because of the Hegelian tradition and stuff like that. But I think you're right in the sense that it's not a utopian thing, because Marx and Engels both recognized in the founding documents that it would be a struggle. It wouldn't happen overnight.
I think that's just such a huge point. Is like, and Engels especially wrote so much about it. Is like, look, first of all, we're not saying we have all the answers. That's the number one thing. If you ever meet a socialist or a communist who tells you they have all the answers, run for the hills. Number two, we are under the full disposition that It's not utopian. It's just a new society, one in which there's not to say competition won't exist, right? Like, and what I mean by competition is
the Olympics won't go away.
Yeah. There's still going to be sports and stuff like that, but here's the difference.
Communism, there's still going to be sports.
We're talking about the end of competition that literally means if you fail at this, you will be fucking homeless. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like the end of that
extreme competition.
Extreme, like survival of the fittest type.
Social Darwinism.
Yeah, social Darwinism, exactly. Social Darwinism, like the end of a social Darwinistic competition. And that's really, you know, the bread and butter of it. I don't even want to go into more detail than that because I know like the listeners that we've targeted are very, it's very much for an introductory level, and that's what needs to be understood. And with that, you know, with that knowledge gifted, you need to take that, and then when you're doing your own research, have that in mind, because it's easy, I think, for the young socialist or the early socialist, not knowing that reality, to get really hung up in dogmatism early on. Right. And it's why you have, you know, 70 different splits within the left.
And sectarianism.
Why you have 12 different Trotskyist organizations, 12 different Marxist-Leninist organizations that all claim to have the answers. In reality, it's just a miasma of dogma that is in no way beneficial to the working class, is in no way beneficial to the left as a whole, and is ultimately going to be thrown into the dustbin of history. Sorry about you.
It just, you know, results in a lot of infighting.
Basically, it's not that we are not advocating a perfect society. What we're advocating is a better society.
Right. And Marx was explicitly historical in most cases, and he received a lot of criticism about it, especially if you're familiar with Karl Popper's criticism of Marx, very critical of the historicism of Marxism as an ideology. So it definitely has historical roots, and historical analysis, like we mentioned in, you know, the introduction, is a very pivotal point of Marxism. So with that in mind, we just want to state that the goal of Marxism is proletarian internationalism, a workers' movement, and overthrow of class hierarchy in society. We want to thank everybody for listening to our first episode. We hope you enjoyed and learned something. Certainly this isn't an exhaustive approach, and we hope to add more to that as the discussion goes on. Our primary motive here is to just increase the value of the discussion in leftist and Marxist groups, so that we can educate people, because that's the way we see moving forward in terms of a real quantifiable socialist project and movement. So with that, thank you guys again for listening. We're going to have in the show notes some links to some information or further reading. We hope you tune in next time. Thanks again.
Thanks.